boy running late for class finds a baby locked inside a car. Without hesitation, he rushes the baby to the hospital. Upon arrival, the doctor breaks down in tears when she realizes that Brookfield stirred to life under a sky already blazing with summer heat. The small town seemed to embrace a lazy rhythm, but for Ethan, there was no time to lose. The 16-year-old sprinted down the uneven sidewalks, his backpack swinging wildly behind him as he dodged a trash can and narrowly avoided colliding with a newspaper stand. He was late again. Ethan's mind raced with excuses he could give his history teacher, Mr. Porter. None of them would work, and he knew it. The man was unforgiving when it came to tardiness, and 3 strikes meant an automatic week of detention. His lungs burned, his sneakers pounded the pavement, and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead as he muttered, "One more block. Just one more block." The world around him blurred. Familiar streets, storefronts, and faces turned into a background haze as Ethan focused solely on reaching school. But then, a faint noise cut through his concentration. It was muffled, weak, and out of place against the backdrop of a quiet morning. He stopped abruptly, his shoes skidding on the sidewalk. The sound came again. A cry. Ethan turned toward the nearly empty parking lot of a nearby supermarket. The noise was faint, but it grew louder as he approached an old, sun-beaten sedan parked alone under the relentless sun. He squinted through the glare and froze. Inside the car, on the back seat, was a baby. The child was strapped into a car seat, its tiny face bright red and shiny with sweat, its hands weakly pressed against the window, and its mouth opened and closed in shallow cries. Ethan's stomach churned. "Hey!" he shouted, scanning the lot. "Anyone here? This your car?" His voice echoed, but no one answered. He ran up to the sedan and tried the door handle. It didn't budge. The car was locked. "No, no, no," he muttered, circling the vehicle and trying each door. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Ethan's panic rose with every passing second. The heat emanating from the car was intense. Even standing near it felt unbearable. Ethan could only imagine what it was like inside. The baby's head lolled slightly to the side, and its small chest heaved with shallow breaths. A terrifying thought struck him. This kid might not have much time left. "Hold on, buddy," Ethan said under his breath, his voice shaking as he searched the ground. His eyes landed on a large rock near the curb. He grabbed it without a second thought. "Sorry about this," he whispered, raising the stone above his head. With a decisive swing, he smashed it against the rear window. The glass shattered with a loud crack, scattering shards across the seat and onto the ground. A wave of suffocating heat hit Ethan as he reached through the jagged opening to unlock the door. Pulling it open, he leaned in and carefully unbuckled the child from the car seat. The baby was hot to the touch, its body alarmingly limp. Ethan cradled the child against his chest, his pulse racing. "You're okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for the baby or himself. The child's small frame felt impossibly fragile in his arms, and the shallow rise and fall of its chest sent a fresh wave of fear through him. Ethan stepped back from the car, scanning the lot for help. There was no one in sight. The world seemed frozen, silent except for the baby's faint breaths and the pounding of Ethan's own heart. The town clinic was 3 blocks away, a distance that had never felt so daunting. Tightening his hold on the baby, Ethan broke into a run. Every step felt heavier than the last, the heat pressing down on him like a physical weight. His arms ached from holding the baby, but he didn't dare slow down. The child whimpered softly, its cries barely audible now. "Just hang on," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with desperation. The streets of Brookfield blurred past him. The flower shop, the diner, the newsstand he had almost collided with earlier. People turned their heads as he raced by, some calling out, but Ethan didn't stop. His focus was on the clinic, a beacon of hope at the end of the street. The sight of its white facade gave Ethan a surge of energy. He pushed his legs harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. The clinic's glass doors came into view, but to Ethan, they felt a world away. He tightened his grip on the baby. "Almost there," he muttered, But doubt gnawed at him with every labored breath the child took. Ethan burst into the clinic, his sneakers skidding on the polished floor as the glass doors slammed shut behind him. His voice cracked with panic as he shouted, "Help! Someone help me!" The small waiting room, filled with patients quietly flipping through outdated magazines, turned toward him in startled unison. Behind the reception desk, a nurse froze, her hand midair as she reached for a clipboard. Her eyes widened at the sight of Ethan holding the baby, whose flushed face and limp body told a story no words could convey. Ethan stumbled toward the desk, his chest heaving. "I found this baby? Locked in a car. It's not breathing, right? Please," he gasped, his voice raw from running and panic. The nurse's professionalism kicked in like a reflex. "Get Dr. Reeves now," she barked to an aide, who sprinted toward the double doors leading to the emergency rooms. She rounded the desk and approached Ethan, her hands steady but her expression tense. "Give me the baby," she said softly, but firmly. Ethan hesitated for a split second. He had held onto the child so tightly, so protectively, that handing it over felt almost impossible. But as the nurse reached out, her calm authority reassured him. With trembling hands, he passed the baby into her arms. The nurse cradled the baby and hurried through the double doors, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the waiting room. His knees felt weak, and he leaned against the counter, trying to catch his breath. Around him, murmurs began to ripple through the waiting room. "What happened?" an older woman whispered to a man beside her. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking, "Is the baby gonna be okay?" Ethan heard none of it. All he could hear was the echo of the baby's faint cries, or had they stopped altogether? He couldn't be sure. Minutes felt like hours as Ethan stood there, frozen in place. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence in his mind. His hands still tingled where they had cradled the baby, and he found himself staring at them, as if expecting them to tell him whether he had done enough. A gentle voice pulled him back to reality. "Are you okay, son?" Ethan looked up to see a kind-faced woman in scrubs. Her name tag read Margaret, and she carried the air of someone who had seen countless crises but never grew numb to them. I don't know," Ethan stammered. "I found the baby in a car. It was so hot, and His voice broke as he gestured helplessly toward the doors the nurse had disappeared through. Margaret nodded, her expression one of both concern and reassurance. "You did the right thing," she said. "You got the baby here, and that's what matters most. But is it going to be okay?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's face softened, but she didn't give him the answer he so desperately wanted. "We're doing everything we can. The baby's in good hands now." Ethan's legs finally gave out, and he sank into one of the plastic chairs lining the wall. The adrenaline that had propelled him this far drained away, leaving him exhausted and lightheaded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. As he sat there, fragments of the past few minutes replayed in his mind. The baby's cries, the oppressive heat inside the car, the feeling of the child's fragile body in his arms. For the first time since it had all started, he let himself feel the full weight of the fear that had gripped him. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see the nurse from earlier returning, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from working under pressure. She walked straight toward him, and Ethan's heart climbed into his throat. "The baby is stable," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It was close, but you got it here in time. That made all the difference." Ethan exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a dozen new questions. "Will the baby be okay now? Do you know who it belongs to?" The nurse held up a hand to stop him gently. "The baby's still weak and needs monitoring, but for now, the immediate danger has passed. The police have been called to investigate. They'll want to talk to you." "The police?" Ethan blinked. He hadn't even thought about that. The urgency of the moment had left no room for anything else. "Yes," the nurse said. "We'll need to find out how this happened and where the baby's parents are." Ethan nodded numbly, the enormity of the situation settling over him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling as a flood of emotions coursed through him. Relief, worry, and a lingering sense of helplessness. Somewhere behind those double doors, the baby he had saved was fighting to recover. And for Ethan, the weight of that life in his hands was something he knew he would carry with him forever. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air as Ethan sat in the clinic's waiting room, still reeling from the nurse's words. The police were coming, and his mind raced with what he might need to explain. He replayed every moment since finding the baby in the car. The cries, the unbearable heat, the shattering glass. He stared at his hands again, as if he could still feel the fragile weight of the baby. The double doors leading to the emergency wing swung open, and a woman in a white coat stepped through. Her sharp yet warm eyes immediately landed on Ethan. She was tall, with her gray-streaked hair tied back in a neat bun. Her name tag read Dr. Margaret Reeves. "Are you the young man who brought the baby in?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded quickly, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the tile. "Yes, ma'am. Is the baby okay?" Margaret approached him with measured steps, exuding an aura of quiet authority. "You did well. The baby's temperature was dangerously high, and dehydration had set in. Another 10 minutes, and we might have lost them." Her expression softened as she added, "But you acted quickly. You saved that child's life." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. The relief was overwhelming, but her words also left him feeling exposed. He had simply done what he thought anyone would do, yet hearing it framed as heroism made his chest tighten. I didn't know what else to do," he stammered. "I just couldn't leave them there." Margaret's eyes flicked to the faint scratches on his hands, likely from the broken glass. "It takes courage to act in moments like that. Most people would have hesitated. Tell me, how are you holding up?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. How was he holding up? He wasn't sure. The surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a swirling mix of emotions he couldn't untangle. Margaret gestured toward the small break room just off the waiting area. "Come on, let's sit for a moment. You look like you could use some water." Without waiting for a reply, she led the way, and Ethan followed. Inside, the room was quiet and modest. A small table, a few chairs, and a coffee machine humming softly on the counter. Margaret handed him a bottle of water and took a seat across from him. As Ethan drank, she spoke. "The police will want to talk to you soon. Don't worry, they'll just need to know what happened. You'll be helping them piece together the story." Ethan nodded, though the idea of talking to the police made his stomach twist. I don't get it," he said finally. "How could anyone leave a baby like that? It doesn't make sense." Margaret's expression turned grave. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes it's a mistake, other times it's negligence." Her voice trailed off, her tone heavy with unspoken stories. Ethan's jaw tightened. He couldn't imagine forgetting about a child. The image of the baby, red-faced and gasping for air, was burned into his mind. Margaret seemed to sense his turmoil. "You did everything you could," she said gently. "And because of you, that baby has a chance." Before Ethan could respond, there was a knock at the door. A uniformed police officer stood in the doorway, his notepad already in hand. He had a calm, professional demeanor but carried an air of authority that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "Is this the young man?" the officer asked, glancing at Margaret. She nodded. Ethan was the one who brought the baby in. The officer stepped into the room, his gaze settling on Ethan. "I'm Officer Grayson. I just need to ask you a few questions about what happened." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat but nodded. "Okay." Grayson pulled out a chair and sat down, flipping open his notepad. "Start from the beginning. Where were you, and how did you find the baby?" Ethan recounted the events as clearly as he could. The faint cries, the locked car, the unbearable heat. His voice wavered slightly when he described smashing the window and carrying the baby to the clinic. Grayson listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. You said there was no one else in the parking lot? The officer asked. Ethan shook his head. No. I looked around, called out, but no one came. Grayson nodded, closing his notepad. Thank you, Ethan. That was brave of you. We'll do our best to find out who the child belongs to and what happened. The officer stood and turned to Margaret. I'll need to see the child's medical report once things settle down. Margaret nodded. Of course. As Grayson left the room, Ethan slumped back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Margaret placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. That's the hardest part over. Now you need to breathe. You've done more than enough today. Ethan looked at her, his mind still buzzing with questions. Will the baby really be okay? Margaret smiled softly. With the care they're getting now? Yes, they'll recover. Thanks to you. Her words brought a flicker of relief, but Ethan knew this day would stay with him forever. Every detail, the baby's cries, the heat, the moment he broke the window, was etched into his memory. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the quiet. Margaret stood, her expression shifting to one of resolve. Ethan, stay here and rest for a bit. There's more to come. But for now, let yourself breathe. Ethan nodded, though he doubted he could relax. The image of the baby's desperate eyes lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Ethan sat in the small break room, the bottle of water untouched in his hand. Despite Margaret's reassurances, his mind churned with unease. His thoughts kept returning to the baby, its flushed face, shallow breaths, and the terrifying stillness as he had run through the streets. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Time seemed to move sluggishly, every second stretching into an eternity. The murmur of voices from the hallway occasionally broke the silence, reminding him that, just beyond those doors, the world was still spinning. The break room door opened, and Margaret stepped inside. She had traded her calm demeanor for something sterner, her expression shadowed by concern. Behind her, a pair of uniformed officers followed. Officer Grayson and a second, younger officer with a notepad tucked under his arm. Ethan, Margaret said, her voice steady, the officers have a few more questions. This won't take long. Ethan straightened in his seat, his hands tightening around the water bottle. Okay, he said, though his voice was barely audible. Grayson stepped forward, pulling a chair closer to Ethan. His partner remained standing by the door, watching intently. Ethan, I know you've already told me what happened, Grayson began, his tone calm but probing. But I want to revisit the details. Sometimes the smallest things can make a difference. Let's start from the beginning. Ethan took a deep breath and recounted the story again, slower this time. He described the empty parking lot, the muffled cries, the unbearable heat radiating off the car. His voice faltered as he described the baby's weak movements, the sound of the rock breaking the window, and the suffocating heat that had enveloped them both. Did you see anything unusual in the car? Grayson asked. A bag? A wallet? A phone? Anything that might help us identify who left the baby there? Ethan shook his head. No, I didn't look for anything. I just focused on getting the baby out. Grayson nodded, his pen hovering over the notepad. And you didn't see anyone nearby? No one watching or walking away from the car? No one, Ethan said firmly. The parking lot was empty. The younger officer jotted something down on his notepad before Grayson leaned back in his chair. His face softened slightly. Ethan, you did a brave thing today. Smashing that window could have been risky, but you likely saved a life. That's not something we see every day. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. The weight of their praise felt strange, almost unwelcome. I couldn't leave them there, he muttered. Margaret, who had been standing silently near the counter, stepped forward. Officers, she interjected gently, I think that's enough for now. Ethan has been through a lot. Grayson nodded, rising to his feet. Of course. Thank you, Ethan. We'll let you know if we need anything else. As the officers left, Margaret sat across from Ethan, her expression softer now. You're handling this better than most adults would, she said. But it's okay if you're feeling overwhelmed. What you did today, it's a lot to process. Ethan looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. What happens now? He asked. To the baby, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. The child will stay here until we're sure they've recovered. After that, it'll depend on what the police find. If they locate the parents, they'll have questions to answer. If not, she hesitated. Well, social services might get involved. Social services? Ethan echoed, the words unfamiliar and heavy. Margaret nodded. If the parents can't be found, or if they're deemed unfit, the baby might be placed in foster care. It's not an easy path, but the system is there to make sure children are safe. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. The idea of the baby, so small and vulnerable, being handed off to strangers made his chest tighten. Do you think the parents forgot? He asked, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Margaret sighed. It's possible. People make mistakes, even terrible ones. But it's also possible this wasn't an accident. That's what the investigation will determine. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the enormity of it all pressing down on him. He had acted on instinct, but now the weight of what he had stumbled into felt almost unbearable. As if sensing his turmoil, Margaret reached across the table and placed a hand on his. You did the right thing, Ethan. Remember that. Before he could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Dr. Reeves, she said, her voice brisk. The baby's condition has stabilized further. Vitals are improving. Margaret's shoulders relaxed visibly. Thank you, she said, rising from her chair. Ethan watched her go, a flicker of relief warming the cold knot of fear in his chest. The baby was safe for now, but the unanswered questions loomed like storm clouds. As he sat alone in the quiet break room, Ethan felt the weight of the day settle deeper. This wasn't just a moment of heroism. It was the start of something far more complicated, something that would stay with him long after he left the clinic. Hours passed before the police returned to the clinic, their presence stirring whispers among the staff and visitors. Ethan had stayed in the break room, his nerves too frayed to leave. He sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. When the door finally opened, it wasn't an officer who entered. It was Dr. Margaret, her expression unreadable. The baby's parents have been found, she said, her tone steady but tinged with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Ethan sat up abruptly. Are they here? What did they say? Margaret took a seat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The father arrived at the clinic after the police tracked him down through the car's registration. He was distraught, Ethan. He says he thought the mother had taken the baby out of the car when they arrived at the supermarket. Ethan's stomach churned. He forgot? How do you forget your own baby? Margaret sighed deeply. People underestimate how distractions, stress, and routines can lead to catastrophic mistakes. The police are speaking with both parents now, and they'll determine if this was negligence or something more serious. Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again, and Officer Grayson stepped inside. His expression was firm but not unkind. Ethan, the parents would like to speak with you. If you're up for it, I can arrange it. Ethan hesitated, the thought of facing the people who had put the baby in danger filling him with both anger and unease. But after a moment, he nodded. Okay. Grayson led Ethan down the hall to a small consultation room. Inside, a man sat hunched over, his face buried in his hands, while a woman stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The tension in the room was suffocating. The man looked up as Ethan entered. His eyes were red and swollen, his face etched with guilt. You're the boy who saved my child, he said, his voice breaking. Ethan froze, unsure of what to say. The woman turned from the window, her tear-streaked face pale. Thank you, she whispered. I can't even begin to. Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. The man stood, his movements unsteady. You gave us a second chance. If you hadn't been there, he trailed off, his words faltering under the weight of his emotions. Ethan's anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, flared. How could you leave a baby in a car? He blurted out, his voice sharper than he intended. Do you even understand how close it was? Your kid almost, He stopped himself, the words too painful to finish. The man flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "I thought my wife had taken him," he said weakly. "I swear, I thought." "You thought wrong," Ethan snapped, his voice trembling. Margaret, who had followed them into the room, stepped forward. "Ethan," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I understand your anger, but this family will live with the consequences of this day for the rest of their lives. They've made a terrible mistake, and it's not our place to punish them." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The man sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat, while the woman continued to sob softly. Ethan looked at them, his emotions a tangled knot of frustration, pity, and lingering fear for the baby. Margaret turned to the parents. "Your child is stable now," she said softly, "but this incident will have legal and emotional repercussions. The police and social services will be in touch to ensure the safety of your family moving forward." The parents nodded numbly, their gratitude and remorse heavy in the air. As Grayson ushered Ethan out of the room, the man's voice called after him. "Thank you," he said again, his voice breaking. "You'll never know how much it means to us." Ethan didn't reply. He followed Grayson back into the hallway, his steps slow and heavy. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day was long gone, leaving behind only exhaustion and a lingering ache in his chest. Margaret caught up with him as he neared the clinic's entrance. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm and steady, "I know this has been overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. What you did today, the courage, the compassion, it matters, not just for that baby, but for everyone who saw it. You've shown us what it means to act selflessly." Ethan looked down at his shoes, unsure how to respond. Her words felt heavy, almost too much to bear. But deep down, he knew they were true. As he stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, Ethan took a deep breath. The air was still warm, but it carried a coolness that hinted at evening. He stared at the horizon, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. The baby was safe. The parents had a chance to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan had found something in himself he hadn't known was there. The days that followed blurred together for Ethan. Life in Brookfield returned to its usual slow rhythm, but for him, nothing felt the same. He returned to school, though his thoughts frequently wandered back to the baby he had saved and the haunting image of its flushed, fragile face. News of Ethan's actions had spread quickly through the small town. His classmates whispered about him in the halls, and neighbors stopped him on the street to offer their congratulations. It was overwhelming, and Ethan found himself avoiding the attention whenever he could. "I didn't do anything special," he would mutter when someone praised him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. One afternoon, as he sat in the back row of his history class, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Dr. Margaret Reeves. "Ethan, I've been thinking about what happened and how you handled it. Would you like to visit the clinic again? I think you might find it worthwhile." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to respond. He remembered the warmth in Margaret's eyes when she spoke to him, the calm confidence in her voice. There was something reassuring about her presence, something that made him feel grounded in the chaos of that day. He typed back a quick reply, "Sure." When the clinic was quieter than it had been the last time Ethan had visited. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her white coat crisp and her smile welcoming. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him through the familiar hallways. "I thought it might help to show you a different side of this place. A side you don't often see unless you're part of it." Margaret led him to a storage room filled with supplies, bandages, gloves, syringes, and neatly labeled boxes of medication. "This is where it all starts," she said, handing Ethan a pair of gloves. "Today, I thought you might help us restock some of the rooms." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know anything about this stuff." "You don't need to," Margaret said with a gentle laugh. "It's just about lending a hand and getting a sense of what goes on behind the scenes." As they worked, Margaret talked about the clinic and the people who came through its doors. She described the long hours, the difficult cases, and the small victories that made it all worthwhile. Ethan listened intently, feeling an unfamiliar sense of awe at her dedication. "What you did for that baby," Margaret said as she stacked a box of gloves, "reminded me why I chose this career in the first place. It's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture when you're buried in paperwork and protocols. But every life we touch, it matters." Ethan didn't know what to say. He thought back to the day at the parking lot, to the fear and urgency that had driven him to act. He hadn't felt brave or heroic. He had just felt desperate to help. When they finished restocking, Margaret led him to one of the clinic's pediatric rooms. A young boy sat on the examination table, swinging his legs nervously. His mother stood nearby, her expression anxious. "This is James," Margaret said, introducing Ethan with a smile. "He's here for a checkup, but he's a little nervous." "Ethan, would you like to keep him company while I get the charts?" Caught off guard, Ethan nodded. Sure." James looked at Ethan with wide eyes. "Are you a doctor?" Ethan chuckled nervously. "Not even close. I'm just here to help out." The boy grinned. "Doctors are scary, but you're not scary." As they talked, Ethan felt a surprising warmth bloom in his chest. He made faces to make James laugh, asked about his favorite video games, and listened as the boy rattled off a story about his dog. By the time Margaret returned, James seemed completely at ease. "You have a way with kids," Margaret remarked after James and his mother had left. Ethan shrugged, though her words lingered in his mind. He hadn't thought of himself as good with kids before, but as he reflected on his brief interaction with James, he realized how much he had enjoyed it. As they walked back toward the main lobby, Margaret stopped and turned to Ethan. "Have you ever thought about what you want to do in the future?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I haven't really thought about it much." Margaret smiled. "That's normal. But after what I've seen from you, your quick thinking, your compassion, I think you have the makings of someone who could make a difference. Maybe not as a doctor, but in your own way." Her words stayed with Ethan as he left the clinic that day. For the first time, he wondered if his future might hold something more than the quiet life he had always envisioned in Brookfield. The idea stirred something deep inside him, a spark of possibility he couldn't ignore. Ethan's visit to the clinic lingered in his mind for days. Margaret's words about making a difference played on repeat, stirring a quiet but persistent question within him. What could I do with my life that really mattered? The following weekend, Margaret invited Ethan back to the clinic, not just as a visitor, but as a helper. She greeted him at the entrance with the same calm warmth, handing him a clipboard and a pair of gloves. "Today, I thought you could help organize some supplies and assist with a few simple tasks," she said. "No pressure, just an inside look at what we do here every day." Ethan followed her through the bright hallways, now feeling more familiar. Nurses bustled past, patients moved between rooms, and the hum of conversation and activity filled the air. There was a sense of purpose here that Ethan couldn't ignore, and it drew him in. Margaret led him to a storage room where shelves were packed with medical supplies. "Let's start here," she said, showing him how to inventory the items. They worked side by side, the quiet task leaving room for conversation. "Have you thought more about what you'd like to do after school?" Margaret asked, her tone casual but curious. Ethan hesitated, his hands hovering over a box of syringes. "Not really," he admitted. I guess I've been thinking about it more since, Margaret smiled. "Since the day you saved that baby?" Ethan nodded, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. "Yeah, I guess it made me realize that maybe I want to do something important. Something that actually helps people." Margaret's expression softened. "That's a powerful realization, Ethan. Not everyone comes to it so early in life." As the day went on, Ethan followed Margaret through the clinic, assisting where he could. He handed out water bottles in the waiting room, watched nurses take vital signs, and even sat in on a routine checkup. Margaret encouraged him to ask questions, and he found himself fascinated by the small but crucial details of medical care. At one point, Margaret handed him a clipboard and said, "Come with me. There's a patient I'd like you to meet." Ethan followed her into a room where a little girl sat on the edge of an examination table, her legs swinging back and forth. She looked up with wide, curious eyes as they entered. "This is Mia," Margaret said, introducing the girl. "She's here for a follow-up after a minor surgery. Ethan, why don't you sit with her while I review her chart?" Ethan hesitated, then took a seat next to Mia. She looked at him with a shy smile. "Are you a doctor?" "Not even close," Ethan said with a laugh. "I'm just here to help out." Mia giggled. "You don't look like a doctor. You look like someone who plays soccer." Ethan grinned. "Well, I do play a little soccer. What about you? Do you like soccer?" As they talked, Ethan noticed how Mia's nervousness seemed to melt away. By the time Margaret returned, the little girl was laughing, her earlier tension completely gone. "You have a gift, Ethan," Margaret said later, as they walked down the hallway. "Connecting with people like that, it's not something you can teach." Ethan didn't know how to respond, but her words planted a seed of hope in him. For the first time, he wondered if there was a place for him in a field like this, somewhere he could use that connection to make a real difference. Before he left the clinic that day, Margaret stopped him near the front desk. "Ethan, have you ever thought about volunteering? We could use someone like you here, even if it's just a few hours during school breaks." The idea took him by surprise. "Volunteering? You mean like helping out around the clinic?" Margaret nodded. "Exactly. You'd get to see more of what we do, and it might help you figure out if this is something you're truly passionate about." Ethan thought about it on the walk home, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Volunteering at the clinic wasn't something he'd ever imagined for himself, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table staring at his history homework, Ethan realized something had shifted in him. The idea of his future no longer felt vague or uncertain. For the first time, he could see a path forward, one that might lead him to a life where he could truly make a difference. Ethan's first day as a volunteer at the clinic came faster than he expected. With Margaret's encouragement, he had signed up to help during weekends and school breaks, eager to learn more about the world she had introduced him to. As he walked into the familiar building, wearing a name tag with volunteer printed underneath his name, he felt a nervous flutter in his chest. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her smile warm and reassuring. "Welcome back, Ethan. Let's get started." The day was a whirlwind. Ethan helped file paperwork, observed a nurse demonstrating how to prepare equipment for sterilization, and assisted with minor organizational tasks. While the work was mundane at times, it was the environment that drew him in, the constant hum of purpose, the shared goal of helping others. Late in the afternoon, Margaret appeared in the hallway and beckoned him over. "There's someone here who would like to see you," she said with a knowing smile. Ethan followed her into a small private room, and there they were, the parents of the baby he had saved weeks ago. They sat together, the father holding the now healthy infant in his arms, while the mother stood, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Ethan," the father began, his voice thick with gratitude, "I don't even know where to start. You saved our child's life. Because of you, we still have a family." The mother stepped forward, holding a small box wrapped in blue paper. "This is for you," she said softly. "It's not much, but we wanted you to have something to remember. To remember how much you've done for us." Ethan hesitated before accepting the box, his cheeks flushing. "You don't have to thank me," he said awkwardly. "I just did what anyone would have done." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You didn't hesitate. You acted when it mattered most." Ethan opened the box slowly. Inside was a small framed photo of the baby, now smiling and lively. The frame was engraved with a simple message: "You gave us hope. Thank you." For a moment, Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. He looked at the picture, then at the parents, and finally at the baby, who gurgled happily in her father's arms. "I'm just glad she's okay," he said at last, his voice trembling. After the parents left, Ethan sat with Margaret in one of the quieter hallways, the frame still in his hands. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, staring down at the smiling baby in the photo. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's moments like these that remind us why we do this work," she said. "It's not always easy, and it's not always rewarding in the way people expect. But when you see the impact you've had on someone's life, it changes everything. Ethan nodded slowly. He thought about the baby's bright eyes, so full of life now compared to that day in the parking lot. The memory still haunted him, but now it felt lighter, softened by the knowledge that his actions had made a difference. As the sun began to set, Ethan helped Margaret close up for the day. On the walk home, he carried the framed photo carefully in his bag, his thoughts drifting between the past and the future. In the days that followed, Ethan continued volunteering at the clinic. He found himself looking forward to each shift, eager to learn more, to do more. Every task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward something greater. The more time he spent there, the more his dreams began to take shape. The idea of becoming a doctor, once a faint spark, was now a clear and steady flame. Ethan began to imagine himself in Margaret's shoes, making decisions, saving lives, offering comfort to those who needed it most. But it wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about the connections, the moments of humanity that Margaret had shown him time and again. And for the first time, Ethan saw a future where he could truly belong. The months that followed were a whirlwind for Ethan. Between school, volunteering, and the growing support from Margaret, his days felt fuller than ever before. The clinic had become his second home, and he found himself immersed in the rhythms of its daily operations. At school, his focus sharpened. Classes that once felt tedious now carried a new sense of importance. Science, biology in particular, fascinated him in ways it never had before. Ethan began staying after class to ask his teacher questions, poring over textbooks at night. For the first time, he felt driven not by grades, but by the possibility of something greater, a future he could work toward. Margaret, always attuned to his growth, noticed his increasing curiosity. During one of his shifts, as they sorted through patient files, she said, "You've been different lately, Ethan. More focused." He paused, considering her words. I think I know what I want to do now," he admitted. "I want to help people. Maybe even become a doctor like you." Margaret's smile was proud but measured. "That's a wonderful goal," she said, "but you'll need to work for it. Medical school isn't easy, and neither is the life that comes after. It's a commitment, one that changes everything." "I know," Ethan said, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "But after everything that's happened, I can't imagine doing anything else." Margaret nodded, her voice softening. "Then you have my support, every step of the way." As Ethan's commitment deepened, so did his reputation in Brookfield. His story had become the kind of tale that small towns loved. A local boy who had saved a life and found his calling in the process. One afternoon, while Ethan was restocking supplies at the clinic, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see the baby's parents standing in the doorway, the mother holding their child, now healthy and glowing with life. "We wanted to check in," the father said, his tone warm. "And to thank you again." Ethan smiled shyly, still unused to their gratitude. "I'm glad she's doing well. She's thriving," the mother said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "And it's because of you. I hope you know that." They chatted for a few minutes, their words brimming with kindness and appreciation. When they left, Margaret appeared at Ethan's side, watching them go. "They'll never forget what you did for them," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I think I'll never forget what they did for me." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "They gave me a reason," he said simply, "to figure out who I want to be." Ethan's resolve began to ripple outward. His school counselor, hearing of his aspirations, connected him with a local pre-med mentorship program. Margaret, ever the mentor herself, invited him to shadow her during her rounds. Each experience deepened his understanding of what it meant to care for others, both the rewards and the sacrifices. But as his dream became clearer, so did the obstacles. Medical school loomed as a distant, daunting mountain, one that would require years of hard work, money, and resilience. Late one evening, as Ethan flipped through a college guidebook, the weight of it all pressed heavily on him. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "It's a commitment, one that changes everything." For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Could he really do this? Did he have what it took? But then he thought of the baby, of the parents who had looked at him with such gratitude, of the countless small moments in the clinic where he had felt part of something greater. Ethan closed the book, his mind made up. He might not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing. This was the path he was meant to take, and he would do whatever it took to walk it. Years passed, each one bringing Ethan closer to the dream he had forged in the small clinic in Brookfield. The road was far from easy. Late nights spent studying, grueling exams, and financial worries tested his resolve. But Ethan never wavered. The memory of the baby he had saved, and the spark it had ignited, kept him moving forward. Margaret remained a steadfast presence in his life. Though she retired from the clinic before Ethan graduated high school, their bond endured. She became a mentor in the truest sense, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional firm reminder to take care of himself. When Ethan finally earned his acceptance into medical school, Margaret was the first person he called. Her voice over the phone trembled with pride as she said, "I always knew you'd do it, Ethan. The world needs doctors like you." Years later, on the day of Ethan's graduation from medical school, Margaret sat in the audience, her eyes shining with tears. The auditorium was filled with applause as Ethan, now a young man with a quiet confidence, walked across the stage to receive his diploma. After the ceremony, Margaret met him outside, where clusters of graduates and their families gathered to celebrate. She embraced him warmly. "You've come a long way from that day in the parking lot," she said with a smile. Ethan laughed, the memory bittersweet. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "And yet," Margaret said, "it's only the beginning." Ethan returned to Brookfield after completing his residency, his heart set on giving back to the community that had shaped him. With Margaret's guidance, he opened a small clinic in the heart of town. The modest building quickly became a hub for accessible, compassionate care, a place where everyone, regardless of their means, could find help. The clinic was a reflection of everything Ethan had learned from Margaret and his own journey. He treated every patient with the same empathy and urgency he had felt that day when he saved the baby. One sunny afternoon, Ethan stood in his clinic's waiting room, flipping through patient charts. The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside, carrying a toddler on her hip. Ethan looked up and froze. It was the baby he had saved years ago, now a healthy, giggling child with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. The mother smiled warmly at Ethan. "I thought it was time for you to meet her properly," she said. Ethan crouched down to the child's level, his voice soft. "Hey there, do you remember me?" The toddler tilted her head curiously, then reached out with tiny hands to touch his face. Ethan's heart swelled as he laughed. "Guess not," he said, glancing up at her mother. "She knows your name," the mother said. "We've told her the story so many times. You're a part of her life, Ethan." Whether she remembers that day or not, as they talked, Ethan felt the full circle of his journey. That baby had been the catalyst for everything, the moment that turned his life upside down and gave him purpose. One evening, as the clinic settled into its quiet nighttime hum, Ethan stood outside, watching the sunset cast Brookfield in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret stepped out to join him, her hair now silver and her steps slower, but her presence just as steady. "You did it," she said simply. Ethan smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Ethan, you had it in you all along. I just helped you see it." They stood together in silence, watching the day fade into night. For Ethan, it wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a single act of courage. Under the same sky where it all started, Ethan felt the promise of what lay ahead. This was his purpose, his life's work, and he was ready to embrace it.